passé et l'avenir au secours du présent.
Le beau est toujours bizarre.
Non, je n'y crois pas.
Rien ne distingue les souvenirs des autres moments.
Le bizarre est souvent beau.
C'est cette bizarrerie qui le fait être particulièrement le beau.
Le beau bizarre.
Non, oui, pour moi, oui.
De Zineb Souleimani.
Hello everyone and welcome to Le Beau Bizarre, a free and hybrid sound space, a space that keeps boarding the train to encounter necessary alterations.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are arriving in Geneva main station on platform 7.
As part of the Festival de la Bâtie in Geneva, Nowhere, written and performed by Khalid Abdalla, was presented for the first time with French subtitles. Nowhere is neither confession nor monument, but an anti-biography, a stage written that waves, voices, images and fractured temporalities to question our relationship to the present, to memory and to action. Alone on stage, Khalid Abdalla turned the intimate into a political cartography, from Tahrir Square to the most recent violences, and raises a prescient question: how can we live and act in a world in crisis? We had the chance to meet him for Le Beau Bizarre. Here is our conversation. Enjoy listening. Thank you for accepting my invitation to Le Beau Bizarre podcast. I'm delighted to welcome you to talk about Nowhere, a solo that is neither confession nor monument, but an anti-biography, a gesture that rejects the restoring linearity of narrative in order to embrace the ruptures of life and of history. Alone on stage, you turn the intimate into a political cartography, Tahrir Square and its aftermath, counter-revolutions, colonial survivals, the echo of uprising elsewhere, up to the most recent violences. Yet Nowhere does not simply tell, it fabricates a form, a waving of voices, mental images, disjointed temporalities in order to pose two essential questions. How did we get here, and how from here can we recover an ability to act?
Yeah, really easy, all of it, right?
This here that you explore is not only a place, it is a position, political, moral and sensitive. Your stage writing tests the very words, memory, responsibility, attentions. It calls for a theater that exposes as much as it welcomes, that makes space for fragility, for doubt, and for the courage to look.
It's really interesting as I hear you say all of this, and I imagine someone listening, I imagine them kind of going, really? This all sounds impossible. How can you do all of that in one play or in 90 minutes? Although I actually think that the description that you have shared is actually very, not just accurate, but it's very moving to me, because it is a big part of what I am trying to do. And what's interesting for me, and what's interesting in the journey of making the play, is the reason it does all these things that you're talking about is because the restlessness, there is an intimate restlessness that I have in how I live my life, that exists inside my identity, that exists in terms of how I'm seen, and that exists in relation to the alienation. I feel that what we call the real world or the normal world insists on, how it insists on sort of forcing certain things to become hidden or appear impossible, or force you into positions of things that feel inauthentic to you. And I created this play, Nowhere, as a space in which that could exist, whether it's these multiplicities, these resonances, these histories. And so strangely, hopefully, when you see the play, if you see the play, you feel like, oh wow, this feels normal. And the truth is, it is kind of normal. We all exist with these slightly fractured psychologies, whatever background you're from. When you live in a world in crisis, that world in crisis lives inside you. And when you live in a world in crisis and you have to behave as if this is all normal, then the pressure can become severe. And when you live in a world in which there is a genocide, and you're supposed to go on your day as if there is no genocide, where does all of that go? And where does all of that gather? And so as well, in making the play Nowhere, I try to create a space of belonging for all of this. And that's why it moves in this restless way. And the challenge was to make that into a theatrical experience, which, you know, hopefully it is for those who see it. But yeah, it's funny. And it's interesting also because like this difference between, so yesterday was the first performance in Geneva, la première fois en français.
But you didn't play it in French.
No, I don't, but there is now a tiny bit which here I've decided I would do in French. But the translation of Nowhere in French is nulle part. And nulle part is very different in its resonances to nowhere, because one of the interesting things in English is the idea of now and here and where, when you start to play and know and where, and when you start to play with the words, and here and now when you turn it the other way around, as opposed to nulle part, which is I also love because it's so like definite for me, you know, it really feels very. But yeah, when parts of you don't really have a place, then you're always sliding in different directions.
That's interesting, and yeah, we will also. I hope, speaking about this gesture, you know, how to write and to perform and to share this nowhere, and about what art can also still maybe do in word saturated by the story, yet deprived and just form. But maybe first question, nowhere's begin with here. Where is it for you today, geographically, politically, and intimately, this here?
Well, the here that I speak about in the play, one of the things that's really important right at the beginning, I welcome the audience, and immediately what I try to do, I gesture to the doors as well, and then there's this moment when the doors are shut. At the end of the play, the audience leaves back through those doors, and I make reference to those doors. And I begin to invoke very early on in the play the idea of nowhere in relation to this idea where now there are places in the world now in which nowhere is safe for some people. And when nowhere is safe for some people, wherever they are, I believe that nowhere exists for us too. They say it enters our world in ways that are intimate, that create a charge around the sayable, a charge around the thinkable, and so what we can discover together. And that nowhere is always existing. It is here. Part of what I try to do in the play is summon what I call political ghosts that are ever present, but we decide collectively for some reason to push away and treat as if they're not there so that we can get on with our day and not be constantly bewildered by this feeling. But of course there comes a moment where that crisis reaches a point in you, whoever you are, where you just can't anymore. And so for me, here, now, at some level is a kind of decision, what you decide to attune yourself to. I am constantly between the two. I understand how to live in this world the same way as it seems everyone else does, but I can't keep from my mind the idea of the fact that there is a genocide that has been going on for 2 years. And likewise, this goes back to my revolutionary experience. So in my revolutionary experience, you're in a world, you know, where a week ago people were saying it was impossible that there would be a revolution. And then suddenly you're in a circumstance where, this is 2011 of course, where millions of people are on the streets, there is a revolution, and people have completely realigned themselves to live for this moment and this future. And then a year or two later, in the case of Egypt 2 years later, you have a counter-revolution that completely makes all of that revolution appear to disappear. And then you're like, wait, but that did happen. I'm not mad. And so then this question inside you of how do you live for a future that is not always visible in the here and now. And I attempt to live as aligned as I can with that future that I know will come and I believe will come. But it's a very difficult kind of place to live in. I mean, even think of like the last 2 years or this current moment now in relation to consciousness over the genocide in Palestine. One of the things that's very frustrating if you're active in relation to it is it's very hard. You know, the truth is that what we have done over the last 2 years has not stopped the genocide and probably will not, because it's, you know. However, what we have achieved and are achieving is laying the ground for the change in consciousness which is happening now and will, I hope, if we can live true to it, over the next 10 years, result in the massive changes that are required, that have taken 77 years of Nakba to get to this point, in order to be able to make that change. So you're living for the future in the present, while also having a kind of loyalty to the realignments of the past. And this is why there is this constant kind of slippage for me, because you rehabilitate versions of the past in service of the present so that it can be in service of the future. And that, for me, is how I try to live in the here and now. And of course that's kind of like, it's both psychologically and practically different. But that's why in the play, it's one of the very important storylines for me is my relationship with my friend Ailam, who died sadly of pancreatic cancer. But in the last year of his life really faced the question, how do you live if you can't take here and now for granted? And I saw him during his treatment in Paris, live each day in a way that challenged my sense of how I was living my life as someone who was not sick and about to die. And I would look at him and think, why am I not living with this intensity? Or why am I not living with this openness and playfulness as well? And that's something I attempt to align and realign with the play. You can live your life now in a way that is dead already. Or, to put it a bit more finely, it's not your whole life, because no one does that, and I wouldn't presume to say that about anybody. But there are parts of our life, certainly, where there is a kind of decision that you're not really living, you're surviving. And there's a big difference between those two.
Hello, good evening, and welcome. Thank you for being the wonderful people crazy enough to want to buy a ticket to nowhere. If you're someone who's been brought along and only just discovered that the show is called Nowhere, you might be curious why someone would call somewhere nowhere. And the truth is, it's the best name I've found for this space we're in now. Already appearing more intensely as we shut the doors, and which I hope to explore with you over the next 80 minutes or so. It's a space I've reached as the world moves from crisis to crisis to crisis, and I eventually reach a point where, for me, the stakes have become too high to remain simply as I am out there. So this shared space is my nowhere, and I'm going to try and go places with you that we often don't out there, in the hope that it might unlock something for us both. Now, this nowhere is safe, or hopes to be.
It's very interesting, this idea of time, because there are also in the play the idea of anti-biography. Why claim this anti-biography? What does this refusal of the straight line protect you from, and what does it allow also you to do on stage?
So on a very simple level, I wasn't interested in doing a play about me. I have a huge resistance to that idea. I don't, And also my experience of life in general, I feel like the world makes very stark options about who I am able to be. I would like to be able to be a different person to who the world constantly forces me to be. It looks at me in a certain way, which creates certain possibilities. That's like, to be very simple about it, as an actor, right, looked at, and I graduated from university in 2003, right after 9/11 and the year of the war in Iraq. How I'm looked at creates the opportunities for who I'm able to be as an actor, but that exists in all sorts of other spheres of life. And I'm also, I'm essentially a socialist, right? And when you look at it all as well through a Marxist structural position, you understand that the way that the world is structured creates the possibility of who you are able to be inside it, as opposed to this kind of neoliberal version of the story, which is always about me and how I have taken over adversity to do what I am able to do. I mean, there is a validity to that position as well, right? Because you exist in the world and you do what you do, but it is not the whole story. It's kind of amazing when you start to look at it through the other lens, a little bit like the cube, that you can see one way and you can see the other. When you look at it the other way, And I start to ask myself a question, like I do in the play, like, how was I created? And where do you disentangle who I am? You listen to my voice. And what face do you imagine if you didn't know my name? How do you entangle that? Where does it start from in relation to colonial histories, in relation to Britain and Egypt? Where does it relate, this moment where I discover, you know, essentially, as I'm sort of going into my family histories, okay, so my father was a political prisoner in the 70s, which resulted in him going to Iraq, and then 2 years later there are bread riots in Egypt because Sadat had signed a deal with the World Bank, which stipulated austerity measures, neoliberal deregulation, which meant that for him, because he was well known as a troublemaker, had he returned to Egypt, he would have gone straight to prison from the airport. And most probably there'd be no me, which means there wouldn't be this conversation, which means I am profoundly a child of neoliberalism in a very deep way. And so then if you are, then you kind of think, what the hell is neoliberalism? And most people don't know. Most people kind of go, neoliberalism? I think I understand what it is. I'm not sure I know what it is. And even when you get to the academics, they'll kind of go, well, that's because neoliberalism isn't really very clear what it is. It's many different things. But, you know, there are things that we know, like deregulation, etc., blah, blah, blah. But, you know, fundamentally, it is the form of capitalism that has been dominant over the last 40 years, which has created this world of massive accumulation of wealth, massive deficit of democracy, corporations far larger than the power of governments, and governments becoming subservient to the idea of the power of capital. And you end up existing in this version of this world we're in, where gradually as the democratic deficit becomes huge in every country, not just in the former colonies, but in mainland Europe and the US, with this massive inequality, because neoliberalism for me is the massive driver of inequality. You end up with this world of crises we have, where across the world, the working classes of one form or another, bewildered as to why their existence is becoming so difficult. And there are those that, you know, and that tends to work to the advantage of the far right. So anyway, this is sort of a long-winded way of like, okay, so how am I created? And then I face these crises, and as an Arab, you know, my entire life is faced by the unrelenting slaughter of Arab bodies as a normality. That creates who I am able to be. Either I decide, oh, I'm just going to ignore all of that, what the fuck? Or I am in relation to that. That world is creating me and my choices and framing who I am in the world. So I would much rather frame it as an anti-biography, frame it as something which is questioning this whole idea of how to narrate who we are as individuals, and turning it round, because it's really anti, into the collective. Because also I believe that it's in that collective sense of how we are and who we are and how we belong, and not turning us into a single unit, but turning us into collective units, that there is the possibility of a greater liberation. Because in that individual unit there is profound loneliness, and loneliness is a very disempowering political affect.
But when you use I and when you slip into we?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, it's slippery. I mean, it's like, it is a problem, and I always have this problem, because you can't presume that people hold the same position as you, or that you're the same as them. And of course there is that profound individuality, but I also, that it's interesting, like there's something in vulnerability that I feel is really important there. And that old saying, you know, the more personal, the more universal. And that's why in the play, I think, one of the very important gestures of it is a vulnerability. I'm trying constantly to go to territories that are actually quite hard to do on a personal level and on stage, but there's something very empowering, and hopefully, you know, it creates I hope, a kind of generosity in the room. I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know where the I, you know, the boundaries of the I and the we. I tell you where I think in some ways, not the boundaries, but it's, I mean, I guess at first point, it depends how you begin to define the I. You know, I'm someone who really thinks of the I as well, and as having many parts. And even when I speak to someone who I disagree with, or who seems to disagree with me, I try to speak to the part of them that in the future maybe agrees with me, or in which we come closer. Trusting as well that our sense of identity is a lot more slippery, and the sense of who we think we are. And that's why warmth in general is very important to me. And listening as well, because that's that's where you also, through others, find yourself. It's in motion somehow.
The people demand the downfall of the regime. I first shouted these words on January the 28th, 2011, in a crowd full of hundreds of thousands of people marching to take over Tahrir Square in Egypt. To enter the feeling of a revolutionary moment, you need to understand the depths of collective penury people were feeling before it erupted, the suffocation and the absolute certainty of no future while you live an unbearable present. The spark came in Tunisia. Mohammed Bouazizi, a poor street vendor already in debt, had his goods confiscated by police, and then he was harassed and humiliated, so went to complain at the governor's office where he was refused entry, and so called out, "Wallah la nahrak ruhi kem ma qablunish." I will burn myself alive if you don't see me. And so then, out on the streets, with the words, how do you expect me to live?
Well, how did you stage 2011 and its aftermath? What is the right balance between lived memory, critical reflection, and sharing with the audience? How that can be translated to the stage?
Well, 2011 lives with me all the time. And it's interesting in relation to the history of the play and putting it together. In some ways, really, the play starts as my way of processing. It's a piece of work that is processing my experience of 2011. And interestingly, we had the first, so it was development process. So in summary, I'll try. I'm not very good at summary, as you can see. But I was asked by the producer of the play, Kate McGrath, in 2013-14, if I had a play in me. And I said to her, well, not now, but maybe. I returned to London the day after Brexit. I lived this, and then Trump came to power, and I lived this kind of weird echo of what was happening in Egypt, happening in the UK, and then across Europe, and the rise of the right, and its resonance with the rise of the counter-revolution. I have my first child and my second child, and I reroute in London, and then COVID happens, and then George Floyd is murdered, at which point my body goes, if not now, when? And I write what becomes the first draft of the play in 2020, and then enter a development process. And then the first proper, full, in-space, with all of the collaborators, development workshop happens in September 2023. And 2 weeks later, October 7th happens. And the play had always included Palestine, and there were always sections about it. But then it was ready to incorporate as responses both from my life and the play. And the point is for me, in relation to Arab identity, these are two massive poles of what it is to struggle around the aspects of Arab identity. On the one side, you have 2011 as a positive pole and gesture towards the future, and on the other you have the crisis around Palestine and this genocide, and somewhere between the two is what resonates in my play. And for me, 2011 is something that I have to return to and recreate in the circumstances of the play, so that I can begin to be witnessed and seen. 2011 for me is not just the year of the revolution or what happened in Egypt and Tunisia and so on. It is a relationship with the entire history of liberatory struggle in the region, which returns to my father being a political prisoner, returns to my grandfather being a political prisoner, returns to my family's relationship with the occupation, with the British occupation of Egypt, and these trajectories. And I guess one of the struggles in making the play is I didn't want to make a play where you are just sort of explaining, it's very often the position that you're put in as an other, making a play in a language, in a country which is not about where, And so part of the journey of the play, in terms of how it's dramaturgically structured even, is to draw you in to witnessing aspects of my experience as an Arab Egyptian brought up in the UK, born in Glasgow, living in London with this identity, but in a way that feels, I don't know, maybe just in a way that I accept. You know? I don't know. I don't know if that all made sense.
When you're on stage, was there a moment when you felt the audience shift with you?
I mean, yes. I mean, to be honest, right from the beginning, but there are various different steps, and that's and also one of the things that happens in the play, which is really important, is this dance between darkness and, you know, things that are moving that might make you cry, and sudden humor as a release, and also in relationship with that, which again returns to my friendship with my friend Aylem, but also this shift between, because, you know, no matter the darkness, there is always joy. There is always room for laughter. And somehow if there isn't that laughter, then something is missing. And likewise the other way around. If you have laughter in a way that disavows how much pain there is, it can be very painful. And so I try in the play to move between those two. And I think that's also part of what increasingly develops some of the trust. And that goes with the vulnerability. I don't know. It's sort of like, you know, you just discover these things as you go along, trying to make something that hopefully works, and that you spend the whole time as you're writing it thinking this will never work.
But it's interesting because it's I mean, that's the singularity of the theater, because coming from the cinema, it's not the same feeling with the audience that you can have directly when you play. And yeah, coming from the cinema also, what maybe the question...
Well, the fundamental thing for me about why it's a play as opposed to a film is because I want to gather people in space. And also I want to be in space with other people. Again, this goes back to this question of loneliness that I was talking about, because the ideas in the play, yeah, you could watch it on a laptop or in your ears or on a screen, but what you are generally not able to do is to gather in space with other people, to see what they look like, to feel the energy of how they cry and how they laugh around these ideas that in this part of the, you know, the Western part of the world, or whatever you want to call it, has in general silenced, has made it not possible to talk about Palestine, not possible to talk about these so-called awkward issues in space. And so therefore I insist on having them in space. And also, going back to your question before about 2011, this other thing where I cannot do this play in Egypt. That is also part of its nowhere. If I were to do it in Egypt, it would be a different play as well. But I cannot do it in Egypt. It would put me in prison. And it may put audience members in prison, because you're not allowed to gather. You are not allowed to have that space of belonging. So if you're not allowed to have it here, and you're not allowed, where can you be? You'd return to the idea of nowhere. And then then you construct this space in which you can be. And for me, it becomes an act of embodiment. And you can't really do that with film, or at least with film, you have to do it in a different way. And for me, maybe there is a film version of this in the future, but it's a different kind of contract. And so one of the interesting things about audiences in general when they come and see the play is they very often, at the end, they don't want to leave. It's really interesting. People want to stay in the building, and sometimes they want to stay in the theatre. I think it's to have the possibility to be together, but also we created something ritually together, you know? I mean, it's like anything. Think of any kind of ritual. Afterwards, the space is charged with it. Are you ready to leave? You don't just go, right, I'm gone, I'm finished.
You think that rituals are missing today?
I mean, it depends on who you are, you know, but yes. For me, regardless of that, theatre at its best is a form of real deep gathering ritual in its ancient form, you know, that's really what it was. As opposed to, and I enjoy that too, but as opposed to kind of like a form of entertainment where you watch it and then, okay, I can go back, you know, it's almost like it's helping you continue in this world rather than gathering to kind of go, what is this world? And therefore returning to that other world and kind of going, okay, so now what do I want to do to it, or how do I want to be to it? And that's what I'm trying to do here. And I don't know if I'm right, but I feel like in the kind of ancient Greek way or wherever, that's really what it was in terms of to gather and to relate to the traumas of the moment, but to be able to see them differently. And so then to return to the world and kind of go, right, who am I, who are we?
Who are you? Where are you? Land, borders, movement. First time in Egypt, 2 years old. Father held overnight. 4 hours, 6 hours, 2 hours, 4 hours. Around the age of 4, I'm allowed to cross the line to give him a bottle of water. Why does your father do these things? When I turn 18, it starts for me. 1 hour, 2 hours.
How do you bring in the most urgent present without letting it swallow the peace? And what ethical or formal safeguards did you set for yourself? Yes.
I don't know. I mean, it's like, you know, vulnerability, again, to return to that word, vulnerability, when you have an honest relationship with it, or you search for an honest relationship with it, it becomes a form of strength. If I am comfortable with these things, it helps you become, or helps the audience be comfortable with these things, and it also makes you less vulnerable to attack because you're comfortable. Whatever anyone says, I know what I feel about this thing, rather than be operating in a space of shame, which makes you very vulnerable to real attack and having to feel protective around things. Yeah.
Maybe also the idea is, what can the word peace still mean within a dramaturgy of conflict? Maybe.
Well, you haven't seen the new ending as well, because there's a new ending from the one that you've seen, so you'd have a different sense of, also because of how things have moved. But, well, put it in a different way. One of the whole... So it's interesting. So I originally did the play the first time in October. The first time it premiered in London was October 2024. Which was not intentional. You know, obviously it was the anniversary of October 7th. And the whole way, on the way to that time, we thought, wow, surely things will not be continuing. And of course they were. And now we're coming up to the second anniversary and they are still continuing. And the end of the play is a space which for me, I try, for me and for the audience, to be on the cliff face of the Sable, to go as far as it's possible to go. Now that everything else has been said, now where can we go? And I just did the play in Edinburgh, and it was the first time I had done the play again. And I was worried doing it again that I would feel like I was returning to something that didn't really have value anymore, rather than I was going forwards with something which was giving value to me and to audiences, because it was still taking us further. And there are aspects of the play, as I've constructed it, which I rewrite each time if I need to, or make adjustments to. And a big part of that is the ending. When I first did the play, we were in a world in which saying the word genocide in a theatre could result in it being shut down, or would create a very, very high tension, you know? And now we're in a world in which that word is no longer really controversial. And the world is now coming to terms with the word Zionism. Strangely, that itself can be the most charged word, because we're now entering the world and the wound that exists over the questions of defining anti-Semitism and ideas of who the words never again belonged to. And this returns to this question, which is embedded in the heart of the play for me, of if I were to live each day in the knowledge that it might be my last, what would I do, what would I say, and how could we be different? If we are in a world of such overwhelming crisis, and we recognize that, then what does that ask of us as positions of courage in relation to speech acts or collective forms of being together and working together? And so the play in itself has with time also given me greater courage. I'm a very active person in relation to the Palestine Solidarity movement in the UK and elsewhere, and I have done various things on red carpets, and I was one of the first early on, and part of that for me came from my relationship with the play, to try and live true as well to who it's encouraging me to be and who I want to be in relation to it. I don't want to sort of have written these things and say these things and then not do them in my life. And so to try and search, and this is where the question of the sayable, and I maybe that's also what you were talking about the vulnerability and the ethical dimensions of this. You know, censorship in this part of the world works very differently to censorship in the Arab world, and self-censorship and these questions over what is sayable and what is not sayable, and the way in which what is not sayable or is made silent and awkward de-resources, under-resources, just collective thought and collective being around other potential futures. So that's part of where I try to go in the play, and that's a big part for me of what I try to do with the ending each time I do it. And it's a really interesting challenge, a space, again, because again, the play is at some level always about space. I mean, literally, when you're in a revolution, I mean, this is in French, right? So, like, it was like one of the things that was really, Buchner's Danton's Death. One of the fascinating things about it when I was reading it, because I ended up, weirdly, I was doing a play, I did a radio play of it just before the revolution happened in Egypt, and it was this really weird thing, and so I returned to the play. And of course, one of the obvious, simple things that happens is, like, people are constantly meeting inside their houses. The infrastructure, the literal infrastructure of how to meet and where to meet does not exist. The reason you end up in the outside space is because there is no inside space that belongs to you yet. The reason you're in a sit-in, is because it has to be, there are all these things, they're literal space. And then when that space disappears, I mean, literally now in Egypt, if you stop in Tahrir, there are tanks every day on Friday or whatever, there are police cars to stop you being able to be there. That literal sense of it has a figurative sense in terms of you, in terms of how you live your life and what you say and what you don't say. And so the play, for me, creates this space where I can breathe into those thoughts and think about them and also think about how I would say them in space, in a room, which is not just a room, it is a theatre that has a relationship with how it's funded, that has a relationship with who comes in the doors as an audience, that has a relationship with, media and whatever else. So how do you operate to say things? And if you can find that space, then others can too. And it becomes sort of part of this collective responsibility. Again, I'm searching for in doing the play.
This was Le Beau Bizarre, a podcast from the independent studio Audio Sauti, available on all listening platforms. If you enjoy this work, you can support it through our Tipeee fund. Thank you for listening and thank you for your support.
The second man was Choo-Choo, a master of romance. He loved the damsel in distress, but not as much as dance.